Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Kayla Meyer. Kayla is a licensed trauma therapist who specializes in trauma treatment and mental health. She holds a master's degree in social work and has a style that is warm and non-judgmental. Kayla helps her clients build stronger connections between their minds and bodies so they increase their self-awareness, which can be useful when they become overwhelmed. Kayla also practices a therapy modality called Brainspotting, which unwinds the brain's learned reactions to danger through brain stimulation during emotional activation. In addition to Brainspotting, Kayla practices KAP, Ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, a holistic modality in which ketamine is used as a complement to psychotherapy to help people experience more frequent breakthroughs and sustained improvement in symptoms. Kayla's goal is to give her clients the tools they need for mental and emotional relief, and she enjoys celebrating as they progress towards greater mental health and becoming unstuck in their lives. So, Kayla, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Thank you for that beautiful intro. Loved it. Really happy to be here.
Thank you. I gave a bit of an introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and your story and how you got to who and where you are today?
Yeah. So been licensed clinician for quite a while now. Been practicing altogether for 6 years. Private practice for the last year. This October is my first year anniversary of my practice. Really excited about that. Undergrad, I was poli-sci. I was gung-ho, I was going to be an attorney. And then I was studying for the LSAT. And I started working for a law firm. And no offense to any of your listeners that are attorneys, but I was like, this is not the life for me. Stopped studying for LSATs. Started studying to get into a master's program. And then it's kind of been a really cool journey since then. I worked for the federal public defender for a little while, inpatient for some clinicals. And then right around COVID, there were startups everywhere. And so I went into startup leadership, and I spent majority of my career in that space doing suicide prevention and managing teams. And then I really miss being a clinician. I kind of sat back one day and I was like, I don't know when I decided I wanted to be a corporate girly, but I don't know. I don't want that anymore. And so I started my practice really kind of part-time, small. And then I started working with people and I realized that I really loved it. And I wanted to get back to doing that and not just being what I did. And so, yeah, I've been doing that for a while now. And that's how I got to where I am.
Thank you for that. At what point would you say you knew that you wanted to become a therapist?
Ooh. So I took an internship with a pro bono law firm. And so it was like a legal aid society. And I had to go, and this was in Orlando, like Sanford area. So I had to go to all of these law offices and ask the attorneys if they would give us their pro bono hours. And so attorneys either pay a fee to the state or they can give a number of hours away and then they don't have to pay their fee. And so it was pretty cool. But it was hard to be like, hey, instead of paying this fee, give me 15 hours of your life, which is really like 30, 40, because nothing is going to court. That's 15 hours. And then people started coming back to my office. So they'd be like, okay, well, I'm divorced, but I haven't worked in 8 years. And now what do I do? And so I just created this space where even though I wasn't doing any of the legal stuff, people were like coming back. And it was cool. And I was like, whatever I'm doing now, whatever this is, I want it. I want more of it. And so that led me to go into social work. And when I was in social work, I was like, I'm doing what I did at the law firm. And then in grad school, I realized the whole clinical component of it. And I was like, no, I'm going to be a clinician. Like that's actually so much cooler. But that's kind of how I started. Like when I went into social work, I wanted to be like our referrals, resources, big binders, helping everybody point in the right direction. And the longer I was there, I just realized like my area of excellence expanded and grew as I learned more.
What would you say you enjoy most about what you do and your work as a therapist?
I enjoy when people realize that emotions are not chaotic. I think we grow up and we're so logic brain, and society really loves logic brain folks. And it's like you can ask someone why they did something and they can point their way back to like all the research and all the steps and all of the logic brain. And so emotions and someone who presents emotional or does decisions based on emotion is seen as naive, or they're so emotional that they're chaotic. They cause disruption where they go because they're just emotionally led people. And so what happens is like that logic brain gets really wrapped up into perfectionism. And then you have amazing people who have amazing jobs and they're so focused on like, well, that's my coping skill and it works and society really likes it and I get a lot of praise for it. But then they sit back and they're recognizing that when we give up the negative emotions, we dissociate from them, we give up the good ones too. Like it's hard to form connection to other people. It's hard to form deep connection to a partner, to children, to siblings, parents, friends. And so sometimes we can sit and we can have a thought of like, do people really know me? And then we get in this place where we can feel really uncomfortable with that idea. I'm like, no, they know a version of me. They know the corporate acceptance of me. But they don't know how I feel about those things because I don't know how I feel about things when it comes to like how we want to be treated or what we like to do even. Because those are emotionally led spaces and that's chaos. A lot of times when we grew up where parents were emotionally led, we can really learn that that's chaotic. And so my favorite thing about working with clients is whenever we can get to a place, and it takes a lot of sessions because I can be pretty data led to make people feel comfortable that their logic brain isn't bad. It's a really useful coping skill. And it's worked. Like they're successful and society is really impressed with them. But once we hit that place where they're like, I actually cried yesterday, like happy tears or sad tears, then we're in this place where we're like, oh, you matter. Because you matter, you can have emotions. You can tell people those emotions and you can actually set boundaries. Because boundaries don't make sense to someone who's existing in their logic brain. It's either am I physically capable of doing that or am I not? But whenever you can form this like DNA strand of emotion and logic, then we get to a place where it all starts to kind of make sense. But it takes some therapy to get there. But that's my favorite part. When someone is like, I had this emotion and it didn't disrupt my day or my life. And I let myself be mad because I was actually mad. And I didn't tell myself that that was a waste of time, that my feelings or how I felt or the way this person made me feel was a waste of time.
Wow. I love the fact that you said, well, number one, that was awesome. Thank you for that. I love the fact that you said when you ignore or when you lose certain feelings, when you ignore the bad feelings, you lose the good ones too. Because I don't think I've ever made the connection between the two of them. But yeah, I mean, if you're ignoring something, you also ignore what happens because of that, which would be any good feeling. You're just ignoring feeling, period. So all of the emotions are caught up in the spectrum of ignoring.
Yeah. Yeah. And we can feel really dysregulated by the concepts that feelings matter. And sometimes the people that I work with, they can have a physical reaction to feelings because we go through this like intake and it's like, what do we believe that we deserve? And even the word deserve to someone who's like really logic brain is like, you deserve nothing. You deserve whatever you worked for. And it's like, yeah, but is that true? because I think we all deserve a level of human interaction and kindness. But that concept, because we haven't interacted with emotions, good and bad, for so long, it feels yucky, for lack of a better clinical term. And so they can recoil. And we sit there in that, and we acknowledge that. And we're not trying to take away the logic part of us or the really productive part of us that's gotten us that far. And that's an important part of therapy. Like, yeah, we're processing and it's a journey, but we don't need to shed a part of us that's helpful. We can integrate them with other parts of us that we want to see too.
Thank you again for that. You are such a wealth of knowledge. And one of the things that we talked about before we started recording was that you are quite young, as to what some people may consider what a therapist should be. And I think that you have kind of shattered the glass, so to speak, of age being something that can be a determining factor on a therapist's skill set, knowledge base, experience, or worth. So I am super glad to be doing this with you, and I'm also grateful that you have done the work that you've done to be here.
Well, yeah, it's a fantastic space that you've kind of created, and for really good reasons. Pre-recording, we also said that this is my first podcast, and so this may come off naturally, but I've never done this before, and it is a little bit scary. Very much so your world of things. But yeah, age, it can be important. If it's important to someone, then it's important to them. But it is one of those things that we sit back and we ask ourselves why. Then we can really create an internal kind of dialogue and questioning about it. Because sometimes when we need someone who's the same age or older, we're trying to create a lot of similarity. And then the clinician matters, and they're taking up space in your session. Versus whenever you go to someone that you feel the most connected to, or you feel like you can do really good work with, or whenever you're in that consultation, and I'm sure we're going to get to it, but like, what are the questions that you ask in a consultation? And I always encourage people to ask, what have you done since? Like, as clinicians, we have to do CEUs. And so it's part of our relicensing. And some clinicians will choose to do random CEUs every year because they're generalists. And some clinicians will choose to specialize. And like, these are the CEUs. And then I turn it into a certificate, and I turn it into a part of my kind of clinical identity. And so I encourage people to like ask that question. What are you doing? What are you working on? How are you serving this niche better? And if they know those answers, or they could be like, I'm just starting out to specialize in something, then that's someone you could probably work with apart from age. But whenever you're going to someone, because it's like, oh, you need to be, I know some people, it's like really important to them. They're like, if I'm a vet, you need to be a vet. If I'm a mom, you need to be a mom. If I'm divorced, you need to be divorced. But then are you looking for a friend? Are you looking for a clinician? Because I don't need to be any of those things to really help you process where you are in your mental health. And unfortunately, I cannot age myself, so I cannot be old for you.
And also, if you're looking for someone that is very similar to you, they may not be able to be unbiased or be objectionable because there's a connection there. And now, like, if you become too friendly, can they really be your therapist? Can they really challenge your thinking without saying to themselves, am I going to hurt his or her feelings? And when that, I feel like, becomes a component of therapy, you're no longer in a therapeutic space. It may be more so, like you mentioned, like coaching or just talking to a friend.
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of value in coaching, a lot of value in spiritual guides, a lot of value in a solid support system that makes you feel seen and heard. All of those things matter. And maybe you're in such a stable place that you don't need therapy. And that's fine too. Like, graduate from services. Like, that's a part of what a good clinician would also want for you. But it is one of those things, like, if you really need me to have done what you're doing, then you probably want to coach, because that's what a coach does. They're supporting from their lived experience. They're saying, hey, I did this and these were the steps I took. And now I'm here. And you admire where I am at being here. But a clinician isn't anywhere. We're sitting back. And that's kind of one of the really cool things about brain spotting. You mentioned it in the intro, is that it's called like being the tail of the comment. And so your client is the comment. And that comment is super powerful and amazing. And as a clinician, you're the tail and you just follow. And so you don't get to lead. You get to ask why. You get to invite them into emotion. You get to show them that emotion isn't a disruptor. But it's not about me. It's not about my experience. It's not about getting you to where I am. You're the comment. You're doing the cool, powerful stuff in this space.
I love that analogy. Also,
That's
since
David.
you mentioned it, huh?
I said that's David Grant's. David Grant, don't be mad at me. I just do it.
I did mention it in the intro, and you just mentioned it as well. One of the modalities that you practice is brain spotting. So, can you tell a little bit about how brain spotting works?
Yeah. So a few minutes ago, when I said like, as a clinician, you can choose to let your CEUs build onto a certification, or you can just do generalist kind of CEUs. And so, whenever I was working corporate, my company at the time, which was super cool, they would give us money to get education. So they'd be like, whatever you're interested in, go do it. And so I used that for the level 1 training for brain spotting. And then that's actually what brought me back into like wanting to be a clinician, because I knew from grad school, I didn't want to hold talk therapy sessions where all I had was cognitive behavioral therapy. I didn't want to be a generalist because we're almost ruminating sometimes. And sometimes when people think of young clinicians, they think of that. Like, oh, I'm just going to ruminate on my stuff and there's no solution to it. Brain spotting taught me, and then I became certified and gained like all the skill set that we don't have to ruminate. There's actual tools and things we can do. And so when we think of brain spotting, it's really focused on like our brain existing in 3 parts. And we know that it exists in lots of different parts. But we have our frontal cortex, and then we have our mammalian brain. And this is where like our memories and our trauma is stored. And then we have our kind of like dinosaur brain. This fancy tattoo to show you. This dinosaur brain down here. And this is what's going to turn on or turn off our trauma response. And once our trauma response is turned on, we're freezing, we're fighting, we're flighting, we're fawning. Majority of those memories are stored in your mammalian brain, because we still have to exist day by day. Doctors still got to be doctors, nurses still got to be nurses, teachers still have to be teachers, therapists still have to be therapists. And so when this is turned on, it's stored here. And sometimes we call it flipping our lid, where we'll have a moment where things have built up so much that our frontal cortex will flip up and we'll get bombarded and flooded with all these memories. And then we'll cool back down and we'll be like, oh my God, that was so weird. I'm never doing that again. Right. And then all of those memories are stored here. So brain spotting lets us access these memories and actually process them, so that we're not needing to flip our lid, and we're not needing to minimize the moments where we had to turn on our trauma response. And so that's kind of the version of brain spotting that's easier to understand than thinking about it like reprocessing all your cords and all that stuff, which it does. It does a bunch of brain work. It creates new neural connections. It's really cool. But if you think of it that way, and like, what are we doing? What's our purpose of brain spotting? I guess that analogy would be a little easier to process and digest.
So, like, what would a brain spotting session look like? Like, do you put electrodes on people's head, and is there like a what, to make it easy for someone who has no clue what it is, like,
Mm-hmm.
how does it work?
Yeah.
Not how does it work? What does it look like?
Mm-hmm. So definitely not doing any spooky season Frankenstein things. So we'll start a talk therapy session. And so we'll start talking about a memory. And then Brainspotting, we use the term activation. And so what activation level is that for us? And where are we feeling that activation in our body? So if we think about a particular memory, moment in time, or belief about ourselves, right? So if I'm sitting here and I'm like, I'm not worthy, like I probably have like 15 memories that come up. What do I actually believe? I don't believe I'm worthy. And so we sit here and we talk about not being worthy. And we listen to bilateral stimulation music. And we go into that place of what's coming up for us. And then we pull out a spot, and I can take all the magic away. We pull out a spot and we find where this is activating for us. And your therapist will do that for you. And I also encourage my clients. Once my clients start working with me a lot, they'll be like, okay, stop. It's there. We move it really slow across, or there's lots of different setups we can do. And if you're a certified clinician, they know like inside, outside, all of the good things. But that's what we do. And then we just stay there. And we stay there until you tell me that you're ready to move your spot, or until our particular type of brain spotting, where it's part of it that we're going to move. Sometimes we can even double spot. I have 2 or 3 of them. And so they can put the positive associations of something and then the negative associations of something, and then go into that deep mammalian brain of like what's coming up for us here. And it's a much different session because your clinician is holding space for you. And some people, when they're spotting, they talk, and some people don't. And so sometimes we're silent for 50, 55 minutes. And then we'll step back and you'll leave that mammalian brain. You'll typically have an emotional response. And then we'll check in how we're doing. And then some clinicians don't do like an integration session, but I do. So the next session, if your brain spotter doesn't talk, then the next session, we're like, where were we at with that? And then we recheck in to I am worthy. So in that first session, if I'm not worthy was an 8, like that's really activating. I'm not worthy. And I really believe that. And I feel it really heavy kind of on my chest. The next session, I get to give you that kind of like trigger statement again. And then ideally the person would notice that they're less activated by that statement. They've gone into those moments in time and they've given the parts of them that existed in those moments of time an opportunity to feel.
That sounds really awesome. And
Yeah, Brainspotting is super cool.
I think that, a lot of people think therapy is just sitting on the couch and talking, but when you break down like that modality of therapy, how you're actually reprogramming the brain, like that's huge. That's some deep, deep healing.
Yeah, it is. It's actually, it's pretty cool. And that's one of the things that like, whenever we said, what's my favorite part? It's when people get exposed to their own emotions and then they sit in them and they recognize that they're not chaotic. And so Brainspotting is a super helpful tool to get all of my clients and me to my favorite part and being like, these emotions are actually real. I didn't just make it up. So much trauma, we sit back and we're like, what was it real? What did really happen? And then we brain spot and we're like, F word, that actually was real. And it was super hard to sit in and be exposed to. But it's nice not needing to do it alone or being expected to know what to do to actually help trauma and the symptoms of trauma.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So another thing you do is psychedelic therapy. How does psychedelic therapy work, and what have you seen it do for your clients?
Yeah. So psychedelic therapy in this, like, I'm going to niche and specialize in trauma. And then, so I work with anyone who hates emotions. Like we're really viewing them as chaotic. That's a key indicator for me that like something happened along the way. And then I really work with adverse childhood experiences and then the female identifying people. And so it's not gendered, like I'll work with anyone, but those are the majority of the people that would come to me. And it could be any gender, but you have to have one of those 3 things going on. Like my practice is pretty small. It's just me. My assistant Jackie, who keeps me sane. Shout out to her, actually. She's great. So it's just us. And so I keep it small for that purpose because I want to do really, really good work if you've been exposed to those things. So I got certified in Brainspotting, and then I was like, well, this is awesome. Love it. Really effective. Some people need medicine. And getting certified and being a ketamine-assisted psychotherapist, it's medicine. We think about a modality. We think about Brainspotting. We think about cognitive behavioral therapy or solution focused or psychodynamic, EMDR. These are all modalities that your clinician can choose to learn. And then they can also say, well, I want to be a somatic therapist. So I'm going to be somatic. I'm going to believe that our body and our brain are connected. And I'm going to practice these 3 modalities, right? Or I'm going to be a relational therapist. I'm going to believe that our relationship really matters. And I'm going to practice these 3 modalities, right? So therapists get a lot of choice in going into what they want to do. And so me sitting and realizing, how is it that I want to practice? And what do I want to say that I do? I wanted to do the newest and the best. And that's kind of an indicator of my brain, what I need. And Brainspotting is new. Brainspotting is newer than EMDR with longer lasting results, according to the research that I've had access to. And ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, very new. And it's a model. It is a legal form of medication used in a session with a licensed therapist where it's 2.5 hours. So it's a lot different than your typical kind of like 50 or 90-minute session. And in the beginning, you take your medication and there's a whole setup for it. We pay a lot of attention to the set and setting. And that's a really big deal with ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. And so what is the mindset? What are we going into needing here? And then what is the setting? And so ketamine, I offer it remote, and I also offer it in person in my office in Dallas. And so I can control the setting if you're in my setting. And so there's soft blankets, and you take your shoes off, and you have headphones. And then once you're done with the medication, and we've spent about 2 hours together, we have a snack together, and I can control all of that kind of setting. But both of those things would be really important to a really productive kind of ketamine assisted psychotherapy session. And I personally don't leave out the prescriber. Some clinicians get licensed and they work casually with their prescribers. I'm part of a community of prescribers, Journey Clinical. And so I get to read all the notes because the prescriber is the ultimate one that's like saying, if this person qualifies for ketamine assisted psychotherapy. And it's nice to have a clinician who wants to know the prescriber outlook too, and who has the support of your prescriber while you're there. And so ketamine's super cool, but I think it's super cool when it's safe.
Are there a lot of misconceptions about like psychedelic therapy or ketamine therapy?
Oh, absolutely. I think anytime, all psychedelics are like a Schedule I drug still. And so we have to think about that. Like it's a big deal. And the stigma that comes associated with that. And ketamine being in that like family of psychedelic assisted therapies. And for a clinician, we utilize the medical model. And so if you're going to a licensed clinician, there's adherence to things that we have to do in our liability and your prescriber's liability and all of these things, but it's very modeled the same way that if you're a clinician who practices IFS, it's modeled, or Brainspotting, it's modeled. So we get to put our own flair on things, but you don't get to recreate because you follow the model and the protocol associated with it. I think sometimes society isn't aware of that model, and clinicians aren't out here branding like what they're doing or the setup for all of the things. And so I think whenever we think about psychedelic, we think about people who casually use psychedelics. and have had their own work and growth in that space. We think about people who take international or not super legal trips here and use psychedelics and have had really intense experiences in that space, and sometimes need to come to a clinician to like integrate them into how they feel. And then you think about like ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, it being 2.5 hours with an integration session next week. That's a much different purpose, much different intention. And I think sometimes society views this as this, right? Like my ketamine-assisted psychotherapy session is not us at a rave dancing together in my office. Like and each of those have their own purpose. And I'm of the space that medicine is medicine, and psychedelics are medicine, and ketamine is medicine. But I think that's where the misconception comes from. Like, I don't always know where someone's bias comes from. I think there's bias in mental health, and there's bias in medicine in general. So sometimes maybe it's that. But if I had to like really think about the societal kind of perception, is therapists are just like raving with people or something.
That's funny. I mean, you mentioned a lot of things that could be indicators of why there's bias, and a lot of people don't know about psychedelics, or they may think about the 60s and the whole love peace movement, and how people were having these trips on acid, and some people may have never come back and things like that. So there. And the funny thing is just, something can get a bad rap, and it will have a bad rap even if somebody, like really never takes the time to learn more about it. It's just, I heard it was this, and, my mom told me it was this, or, my family member told me it was this. And it's that for you just because someone told you it was that. So thank you for getting into some of the misconceptions and detailing what it is and what it isn't.
Yeah. Yeah. I also really encourage people to read the research. Like, I know that's such like a nerdy thing to say, but actually read the research because it's so cool. Like, it really is. Like, it was important to me that I like listed it all out on my website, because I don't think like journals, you have to pay a subscription to like read journals, or publications from journals. And so like going through and paying attention, like if you're like, oh, I want to do ketamine therapy, and you have your own internal bias, read the research and make sure that you really want to. But also recognize that this isn't pretend. These are like collaboration and years of outcomes when it comes to ketamine. And the government doesn't just let us do things because we want to. And so currently kind of MAPS and CAP and psychedelic assisted therapy in general. And some states even allow other things. Like California was recently lifted one of their laws this past week in like psychedelic. And so every state kind of has their own thing. The CAP's the only thing that's like legal across the board. But just going into the research of it, because there's a lot of it to like prove to the FDA that this is effective. And I think it's because of the things of the 60s, when we're trying to take something that everyone then was like, oh, this is super helpful and it's medicine. And the government was like, no, how dare you? And so now we're coming back and trying to do it in this way where it's like, okay, we'll adhere to all of your rules, and you tell us if it's a medicine. And that method has worked out a lot better, because now we have ketamine. And I think it's going to continue, that as long as we adhere to the medical model, which is definitely not going to be mushrooms in your backyard, it's going to be something coming from a pharmacy and something that's compounded, and everyone can have their opinions about that. But the medical model will increase access.
I don't think it's nerdy to read the research. I think anybody will, if it's important to you, you'll do what you need to do. Like if someone's going to buy a new car, they're going to research the car. But if ketamine or psychedelics aren't important to somebody, you may lean more towards just listening to hearsay or what, society says. So, I just think it's important to do your own research. That way you're informed regardless of what it is.
Yeah. Or listen to cool podcasts like this one. This works. I read the research.
Okay, so we talked about some modalities that could be helpful, but
Mm.
what would you say is the root cause of the reasons that people need help to begin with?
Mm. So I had a really cool answer. And then we were talking for the podcast, and then you said my answer. And then you said it was from a movie that I hadn't even seen.
Oh,
So I'm not going to change my answer. But I will now give credit to where credit is due. And it's this cool movie. What is it called? I wrote it down. I
Good
am going to
Will
watch it.
Hunting.
Good Will Hunting. Okay.
Can't believe you ever seen it, but that's a whole nother podcast.
It probably is. But we were talking, and it's really getting to this place where you're recognizing that at some point something happened that wasn't your fault. And recognizing what that does for your central nervous system. To really sit in a moment where you didn't have control. And maybe that brings up fear. Maybe that brings up anxiety. Maybe that brings up a lot of shame. And I think that that's its root. Like if we could face that head on, like sitting down and being like, what happened in my life, not as an excuse, but as a genuine like reflection that I just didn't have any control over. And we think about trauma, Rick Doblin kind of laid it out in like 11 different major modalities or reasonings. So there's adverse childhood experiences, there's racial tensions, and how you grew up and where you grew up. There's weather. That's like huge. You can't control those things. And so in all of his, a similar kind of feature to them is that there was no control. And so something happened that wasn't your fault. And we don't have to disassociate from that. And we don't have to build lots of walls around that. And that doesn't mean that we don't. It just means that we don't have to. And so I think that that's probably my answer, which is your answer, which is this movie's answer, which is probably a lot of the clinicians' answers. And
Yeah,
that's a cool thing that we can agree to that.
it may be difficult if you didn't grow up in a space, or not even growing up, but like you just have never um, had the space to understand that things that happen to you not as a result of you deserving them, but just because they happen. Like two things can coexist at once. You can have a really traumatic experience and also it not be your fault.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Or it not be anyone's fault. Sometimes when I talk to people and I tell them what I am, and usually I'm in Texas, so usually older people, and they're like, "Oh, so you just help people complain about their parents?" Like, I mean, are their parents at fault? Right. But sometimes it's no one's fault. Sometimes it's our profession, and we're not going to leave our profession, but we can recognize that there are components of our profession, which is secondhand, firsthand, thirdhand trauma. And we can have a natural human response to that. It's not our fault. I'm not going to change it. But can I sit down and recognize that that's how I'm feeling? Yeah. So that I don't get burnt out. But then whenever we're thinking about adverse childhood experiences, that's an assessment that I encourage everyone to take. Not if it's going to dysregulate you, but it's free and it's out there, and you can go and type in ACE assessment. And then you get this score, and you could be like, how much is my childhood impacting me? It's really cool, and there's lots of research as to why it was a cool kind of assessment and how it was created. And its intention was for like affluent families in California. And then they're recognizing that the scores really impacted our physical health and our longevity of life. So people that scored positive or really high on the ACE assessment, average childhood experiences, died 20 years sooner than people who didn't. That's a big deal. When we think about trauma, like that's actually a big, this is taking people's time. We don't have a lot of it. It's taking 20 years of it. And it doesn't have to scare us because now we have science and we have medicine. We have things that we can do to calm our central nervous system, to tell our stomach that it can begin digesting its food. And we don't have to sit in knots and wait for something to come and get us. But we can't do those things if we just act like they're not happening to us. And so, and that all goes back to this place of we don't have to blame anyone else for that. We can also just say that's a quality of living, but that doesn't make it my fault. I don't have to accept responsibility. I can say that something happened because something happened.
So thank you for amazing explanation and for giving permission for people to accept that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So speaking of trauma,
Mm-hmm.
what is trauma terminology, and how can someone deepen their understanding of trauma terminology to enhance their support and empathy for those who have experienced trauma?
Yeah. I have a post on my page, and it goes through like the terms, and it's on my Insta, and it's like disassociation and PTSD and complex PTSD and a glimmer and a trigger. And so someone that like really wants to sit down and be like, what is the encyclopedia of, no, encyclopedia dictionary? Mm-hmm. Dictionary of trauma, then you can have that post, and I encourage you to look at it. But for here, for podcast, for conversation, for actually listening, I'm not going to give you a bunch of words in their definition. I would say that how to be empathetic for the people around you in your support system, or to share with the people in your support system that you need empathy, is asking, like really being like, hey, I felt this today. Or I recognize that I said something really big and I didn't have any feelings. And it's just creating a moment where someone can just sit with you. And what you do with that is up to you and your coping skills, right? And so if I'm sitting in my sad and I'm going to a friend and I'm asking, like, let's keep this safe and let's not turn this into anyone else. It's just me, right? And maybe that boundary can look like, I don't want you to solve. And not that I don't care about you, but I don't want to hear about a time that you went through something similar. I just want to tell you about a moment today that I was sad. And that's giving our support system a moment to meet our needs. And that can be a bit of a verbal boundary, and that can sound really kind of different to people. But if we're really looking for empathy and connection, that's a script that can be used. And then they sit there. And then you sit there and you say all the things and you vent the things. And then you get to ask yourself, what do I need right now? And so maybe you need to take a shower. Maybe you need to lay down. Maybe you need to take a really deep breath. Maybe if you're the athletic type, you need to go for a walk. Right? If you live near the water, maybe you need that. And ideally that person can come with you. And we can begin to discuss that, or we can discuss something else. But if we're really looking for recognizing a trigger, recognizing our partner or a friend is dysregulated, it would be just taking a moment and noticing. Just being like, you seem a little standoffish. Is everything okay? And that doesn't mean that it's your fault. We don't have to begin to assume that you're creating why this person is standoffish. And maybe you are, but you're giving them a moment to sit in where they are, and then actually coping, and then meeting their own need and that ability to kind of like self-soothe. And I don't know if you need to be like, did this trigger you? What's your glimmer? Like, do you have PTSD? Because that can seem, you can miss the moment trying to be really clinical. And sometimes as clinicians, we can miss the moment trying to be really clinical. And the reality is that it's good to know those things. We don't always have to act out the knowing of the things, if that makes any sense.
It made perfect sense. And I feel like those were some gems, like tools that you gave to actually help people in a situation or in a moment where they need to be empathetic for a friend and they may not have known how. Now they, oh, well, Kayla told me I could do this or I can do that. And there's something they can actually implement in a certain setting. And I love the fact that you said also that even as clinicians, sometimes you guys miss the mark as well. So that may take some of the pressure off of us trying to be a good friend, good husband, good parent, good whatever.
Mhm.
Just knowing that as humans, things happen. Like you're not always going to get it every time, but these are some ways that you can try to get it, and maybe you'll get better at them if you keep trying and you keep implementing them. And as long as you have empathy as your guide,
Mhm.
you're going to be trying and doing it from a place of love and appreciation and respect.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the thing of like, that's why I didn't want to do like the definition thing, because it's, it can be something where it's just like we're humans interacting in humanness. And that can exist professionally, that can exist in your therapy session, and that can exist in all of the people in your kind of life. Where we can tell someone when they've hurt our feelings, and we can tell someone, I do encourage you to tell your therapist if they miss the mark. Be like, hey, last session, I didn't feel connected when you said maybe what I was going through. And that's okay, because that's a moment where the therapist stopped being the tail of the comment and they started kind of trying to get ahead of it, perceiving where we were going or why we were there. And that's okay. That can be a really cool learning moment. And professionally, you can say that too. Like, hey, there was this moment where in that meeting you misgendered me. And then we had that conversation, right? Not that it's your job to always advocate for yourself, but we have to recognize that we deserve the ability to have people see us for who we are and how we're showing up. And then ideally, in a perfect environment, that professional relationship, the other person can say, I'm sorry, you're right, I did. Do you need anything to make you feel better? Is there something I can do to sit here with you? And I think as humans, we sometimes like immediately turn it back and like, oh, this one time I was here and someone said this, and like we make it about our experience. Or like that's not what that person was asking for. And so, yeah, I think that it can be a moment where we recognize like we're all existing and we're all kind of like bumping into each other. But sometimes when you bump, just pause and be like, oh yeah, I bumped. Like, how are you doing? Because of that interaction. And not everything has to be a conversation of then how am I doing?
If I lived in Dallas and I heard this podcast, I would be calling you like today. Thank you for the ways that you're explaining so many things that are complex or, may be hard to grasp in such a easy to understand way. I think you said humans interacting in their humanness. That is
Yes.
so spot on. I'm stealing that.
Please do.
um, I will. Another question that I want to ask is, in a culture that at times may see vulnerability as a weakness, how do you try to advocate that asking for support is a sign of strength and not weakness?
Hmm. Hmm. That is an interesting one. Asking for support, I think it depends on the perception that we have of asking. Right? Whenever we think of like our support system, asking is hard. Whenever we think of our people where there's not like this like really kind of transactional at times understanding of what's private versus secret, like it's hard when that concept isn't known or when we don't know, right? And sometimes when we come to therapy, that can be a place that we start. Like what's private versus secret, and why do we keep the secrets? And having a secret from someone, that doesn't necessarily mean anything bad. It just means that you wanted it to be private. And so whenever we think like those are all of the things that are going on, whenever we're like, do I ask for help? because then this person knows that I need it and I can't just take it back. And so the easy answer would be vulnerable anyway, right? But that's not real, and we can't do that, because if we could be vulnerable anyway, then we would have asked for help a long time ago. I think the best thing you can do is go to a few consults, get connected with a therapist, feel safe in the parts of therapy that are tangible, like you ethically are bound, that you can't say anything from this session besides if I tell you I have plan and intent to harm myself or someone else. And like rest in that. Like let your vulnerability be there first. And then once you're there for a few weeks and you're like, oh yeah, it doesn't matter if it's private or secret, you can't do anything. Then you can get to this place where you're like actually vulnerable about the stuff that makes us feel vulnerable. Because there's like so many different things. Like it's vulnerable to ask for help. And that can bring up that kind of like feeling where you're like, ugh, or I thought I don't need it. What does it mean if I need it? Right. So just rest in that space of therapy. And once you feel really comfortable, you begin to start building rapport and normalizing that you don't have to trust your therapist right away. Like it would be odd. There's no other relationship where you show up and you're like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to tell you everything about me. You're going to tell me nothing about you. And I'm just going to trust you. Like that doesn't, no. Give yourself time to just rest in that you are going to hold this space for me. And then we can get comfortable with like, why are we actually here? And what's all the ooey gooey stuff with vulnerability that makes us feel really on edge. Right. And at least that's true for my clients. Because like I said, the majority of people I work with lean very heavy in their logic brain. And so if we just jump into therapy and we're not trying to make it really kind of tangible, what we're doing and what are our coping skills and why are we here, then you're telling them to see emotions as emotions and just like start kind of like forming this like relationship with them. That can't just happen, right? Like if I grew up in an environment where I was told my entire life my mom was mad, and then you go to therapy and your therapist is like, well, you're allowed to be mad. And we didn't do any of the work to realize that actually my mom was violent. And violent isn't mad. But we have to get to that place of like vulnerability to be like, yeah, you can be mad. You can be mad without being violent. But until we get there, we can't just tell people, go enjoy the emotions because they're good for us. Because you don't know what they mean for every person or what the story or the overlay is. That was probably pretty long-winded, but I think that answers.
That was amazing. It really was. And I feel like the way that you're explaining things, like, you know, allowing someone to see that they can be mad, and mad doesn't mean it's what you saw mad as maybe when you were growing up, because they may associate being mad with being violent. So being mad means you're violent. No, it doesn't. You can call it long-winded. I'm calling it amazing.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
What can make someone feel like asking for their needs to be met is asking for too much?
If they feel like they don't matter. And so that's one of those moments where if I genuinely believe that my needs don't matter, then saying them or expressing them would mean that I'm too much. Like I'm just too much. I haven't watched it, so I won't lie, but there is a Kelly Clarkson, and I've seen like clips of this podcast where she's going on and on about like her recent marriage, and like she made herself smaller so often because there was this concept that she was just too much. Like she was too famous, or she was too outgoing, or she was just too much. And then she got to this place where she realized that she's not too much. Like, she's existing in her humanness. And that doesn't make you too much. But it takes a lot of work, and I won't minimize that. Getting to a place where you believe that you matter just as much as all of the people in your life that have an expectation of you takes work. Especially if we grew up in an environment where we had to be perfect and we had to prove our worth, or nothing mattered unless we were going like above and beyond. And we're really looking for like the verbal connection of our superior, or of a friend or a colleague or partner or whatever it is. And so it doesn't matter the moment of like, where is it that I can be a lot? If we don't believe that about ourselves, then we can't do that anywhere. There's also a really good book, Assertiveness Guide for Girls. It's pretty good in talking about like professionally why that's hard for women in particular. People identify that as women. But it is a concept all around, though. Like, if you don't think someone's going to meet it, or if they teach you in learned behavior that they're not going to meet your need, it would actually not be logical for you to continue to have it. Right? It's like that old Einstein quote. When you try the same thing over and over again, it doesn't work. And so if your parent or your partner continuously never meets your need, then eventually you're going to believe that that need is abnormal, or it's just too much. We're going to forget that we matter and that that need did matter.
Wow. Again,
I'm not used
thank
to
you
doing
for
talking therapy. I need water. Hmm?
that. Okay, so last question, and I feel like this is a big one.
Yeah.
If you could use your platform to encourage anyone who might be struggling with their big feelings or emotions, or on the fence about therapy, or just talking to
Mhm.
someone, what would you say?
If I could use my platform, I think this is kind of like another one of those things that could be a podcast of its own. They're just super important. I think it's super important to me that whenever we think about our brain and then kind of these three parts, our mammalian and our frontal, and then this like trauma response, and when this trauma response flips on, and we have freeze, and we have fight, and we have fawn and flight, society like really tells us that fight and flight are powerful. Like, so much entertainment like built around fight and flight. And so we forget that people who existed in chronic trauma, they don't get those options. Our brain's one thing is to keep us alive, and to keep us alive for as long as it can keep us alive. And so we think about trauma, and we think about my platform. What would I want people to know? I'd really want people to know that if they fawned or if they froze, that's all their brain could do in the moment. And that doesn't mean the shame just goes away, but maybe it can be the beginning space of recognizing the shame is misaligned and that it wasn't our fault. We could not have done anything else. Like that light switch and what it chooses to turn on, we don't get to control that. There's no override. And so when you're looking at John Wick and all of the people who just run around and run into bullets and fight and fight and fight, and whenever we see really explicit and violent scenes on TV that typically perpetrate violence, and it never shows someone freezing. The person never is like, okay, this is what's happening to me. And so we have this entire kind of stigma around doing exactly what your brain would tell you to do, because so many of us, that's what we do. We internalize when we go, okay, this is what's happening. And if I need to survive, this is all that I can do is let this happen. And we don't have choice. There's no agency there. And so sometimes when I think about my platform, or what I just want people to know, is that freezing and fawning just as powerful, just as impactful as fighting and flighting. and we don't get to choose what we do in response to our trauma.
Thank you for that. That was also a nugget. I mean, you dropped just nugget after nugget after nugget this entire episode, so I'm super grateful. I'm grateful that I reached out to you. I'm grateful that even though you hadn't been on a podcast, you agreed to do this with me. And I'm just blown away at the answers that you gave to the questions and the way that, like I said, you made so many complex things simple and palatable. So thank you for your time. Thank you for what you do and just being here and sharing space.
Thank you for having me. Honestly, you could have been like, no, you've never been on a podcast. Yeah. I think I only have like one reel up. Like something about being on camera and like actually showing up. I haven't quite identified how I want to do that yet without taking away from my clients. And so you created an environment where it's comfortable and it's safe and it's fun too. So thank you. Thank you for having me.
I appreciate that so much. If people want to find you online or on social media, where can they find you?
They can find me on Insta. And so it's Therapy with Kayla. From my Insta, you can go to my little link. I'll link you to all the things that are important. And if you want to like schedule something, I care about you all, but overwhelm my poor assistant Jackie. No, it's in one of those links. The other cool thing though, which I kind of encourage too, is like the research is there. And I had someone make some bilateral stimulation music for me. I use it in my Brainspotting sessions, but it's a really good coping skill. Like if you're feeling dysregulated at work, anything like that, you could put 2 headphones in. Bilateral stimulation is so cool for telling our brain to calm down. And the other thing, just follow the Insta. I really try to post a lot of educational stuff. I'm not too big on, like I'm sure your followers follow some therapists on TikTok and Instagram. I'm not too big on advice or trying to dictate to you what you may have experienced or how it's impacting you. So my Instagram is much more generalized education, coping. So if you're not in Texas or Florida and I can't work directly with you, then that'd be where I tell you to go. And you can listen to me next time on this podcast,
All right. Well, Kayla, thank you so much for this. This is so great. This is literally one of my favorite episodes. And I think that it is because you really just hammer home these things that a lot of us struggle with or weren't able to really understand because maybe we were fawning or freezing and didn't realize that was happening or that we didn't have a choice. And, there was shame or guilt associated with those things. So thank you for this. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you do and for how you do it.
Thank you. Until next time.